Intervention or invasion? An arrest or a case of kidnapping? Making sense of the news coverage on Venezuela. The abduction of a president from a country the Trump administration called a haven for drug cartels, a move the White House now says will help satisfy America's addiction to oil. We'll speak with a specialist on Latin America about how to decipher the news coming out of Venezuela itself, aspects of this story that are not making it into the news coverage. Plus, Iran, the economic protests there that are all over social media, and the political influencers on the outside looking in. After months spent manufacturing consent in America for a military intervention in Venezuela, the Trump administration finally went ahead and abducted the country's president, Nicolas Maduro, who was now locked up in a jail in New York City. And many in the U.S. media, true to form, have echoed the government's talking points for yet another foreign intervention. What has changed is the stated objective. What was initially being sold as a strike on a narco-state is now being marketed to Americans as an oil grab, which is kind of refreshing. A U.S. military intervention stripped of the usual moral justifications, driven admittedly by raw self-interest. Plus, it provides Donald Trump with a useful political distraction, since almost no one is reporting on the Epstein files right now. Add it all up, and this is a story that tells us less about Nicolas Maduro and the Venezuelans who have lived under his rule than it does about America's imperial mindset and the media messaging that comes with that. Historically, when covering America's occasional misadventures overseas, be they in Vietnam, Iraq, or wherever, the U.S. media have often played along.
This incredible hunt for weapons of mass destruction, which is unlike, as you pointed out, anything the United States has ever done before.
Habitually, they have been complicit by parroting official narratives. They have shown some of those same tendencies covering the Venezuela story, the extraordinary abduction and rendition of its president, Nicolas Maduro.
It's hard to believe that Nicolas Maduro will be in court tomorrow. His drug operation has long posed threats to the United States. That is per prosecutors that are going to work to bring him to justice.
The dilemma this time around, the chaotic messaging coming out of the White House and deciding which official narrative to follow.
They were pumping almost nothing by comparison to what they could have been pumping.
So there's sort of a split message from the administration where you have Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who's been insisting that this is a law enforcement operation.
Now there are broader policy implications here.
That Maduro's been indicted, he needs to be brought to justice in the United States. And some of the media has gone along with that narrative.
The actual criminal case against him is pretty straightforward.
But President Trump has had a very different message.
We're going to take back the oil?
About controlling the oil from Venezuela and bringing it to the U.S.
They usually try to put out trial balloons to see if they works for their narrative, but then they start sort of shifting once they see that it doesn't work. They've talked about this as being something related to drug trafficking, and that was what the focus was. However, at the same time, the president was literally pardoning the ex-president of Honduras, who was convicted of actually trafficking drugs to the United States. So as that narrative started to sort of crumble, then the narrative changes to oil.
So the media isn't going fully along with the official narrative because the official narrative isn't clear. It's going in various directions based on who you talk to in the administration.
This is not interventionism. This is
such as when reporters put questions to a Republican congressman with Donald Trump alongside him.
He shut down a narco-terrorist state called Venezuela. This is a good thing, not a bad thing.
And the oil companies are going to go in and rebuild their system.
There's also been a shift in the putative endgame with no more talk of regime change. Now it's a change within the regime, and the U.S. is working with Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. Such confusing signaling has made it easy for U.S. news channels, the ones not named Fox, to pick apart the administration's rationale for its operation in Caracas.
I think there are very few Americans right now who have any idea why the United States did this.
But many mainstream outlets have used some questionable terminology when describing the abduction of Maduro. routinely calling it a capture or an arrest, terms usually reserved for criminals or fugitives, not heads of state. They have avoided terms like act of war or invasion, despite the bombs that were dropped, the 100 people reportedly killed. And the euphemisms do not stop at the U.S. border. Britain's BBC instructed its newsroom to stay away from the word kidnapped.
Some of the language that we've seen, especially around whether or not Maduro was captured or kidnapped, they're part of this larger campaign to legitimize an action that is evidently illegal. And so to not call the extraction of that president a kidnapping, where there is only one country who has the indictment against that president as therefore internationally legitimate, should be a warning sign to the rest of the world that if it happens here, it can happen anywhere.
CNN, Associated Press, Reuters, other major outlets have described the intervention in Venezuela as a clean in-and-out operation focused on the capture of President Maduro. They're very careful to avoid language that would make it appear that the United States would be involved in criminal activities like kidnapping. And that's unfortunate because this is absolutely a kidnapping that there is no legal justification for, that violates the sovereignty of a foreign country. You're removing the individual who leads the country from that country. So it's about as profound a violation of national sovereignty as you can encounter.
I respectfully disagree that he was kidnapped. Maduro was arrested. He was a criminal. And when we go after a criminal, we don't call that a kidnapping. We call that justice. What's happening is the first step in holding him accountable, not just for the crimes that he's committed against the United States, but also against his own people. We actually left most of the regime figures in place, so I really do not view this as an act of war. I view this more as a law enforcement action.
Venezuelan democracy has been decaying since 2013, the year the previous president, Hugo Chavez, died, having anointed Nicolas Maduro as his successor. Following the 2024 presidential election, independent analysis done by academic institutions and media organizations concluded Maduro lost the election decisively, yet he still clung to power. Even governments ideologically aligned with Maduro's in Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico demanded he provide proof of his supposed victory, which never came. International media coverage often portrays Venezuelans as deeply divided, drawing a line between the diaspora, welcoming Maduro's capture,
this party showing no signs of slowing down. Every so often, the music will pick up. You'll hear horns honking.
and Venezuelans at home protesting against it, preparing for a fight.
Supporters of Nicolas Maduro turn out en masse in the streets of Caracas, calling for the release of the Venezuelan president.
The voices that tend to get left out, the Venezuelans who disapproved of Maduro, but who also oppose U.S. troops busting into their country to take him out.
It would be a mistake to suggest that there's no support for Maduro in Venezuela. The support is minimal, absolutely. There's another layer here, though. People don't have to support Maduro to oppose the armed intervention of their country by another country. They're betting on the devil they know rather than the devil they don't.
Maduro was not in power because he was popularly elected. In fact, the election results were clearly fraudulent. And so the vast majority of the Venezuelan people are opposed to him. And we've already seen large-scale demonstrations in support of what happened. Now, will there be some Venezuelans that support Maduro? Yeah, absolutely, there will be. But they have been trying to suppress dissent.
What we're not talking about are the people that are refraining from protesting and celebrating in Venezuela because they're afraid that they're going to end up in the terrorist prison that they have in Venezuela, El Helicoide. And that's one of the narratives that I feel like it's missing from the media, which is the people in Venezuela that are celebrating this but are having to stay quiet because they're fearing action from the government.
Even for those who stand against what the Trump administration is doing in Venezuela, there is value in the way it has described its actions, the naked, imperial self-interest that's at play.
We're going to take back the oil that, frankly, we should have taken back a long time ago.
When George W. Bush led the invasion of another petroleum-laden country, Iraq, he never said, It was about the oil, the way Donald Trump has, lifting the hood, giving us a peek at the engine that has been known to drive the American empire.
In a way, I personally appreciate that the President of the United States is honest about what he's trying to do, because we understand what's going on. They want the oil, and that's what they're going in for, and so we can have an argument about that. I prefer that to the politics of the past, where people would come up with some humanitarian reason as to why we were doing something.
One final angle that has been underplayed. Sometimes the real story is not what we see in the coverage, it's what we do not see. There's been very little attention paid over the past week to the Epstein files, the threat they pose to Donald Trump. Only 1% of them have been released by the Department of Justice, with the other 99% still lying in wait. Perhaps that was the real mission U.S. forces carried out in Venezuela. Call it Operation Distraction, a mission at least partly accomplished for now.
It's notable that since the attack, we've not really talked at all about the Epstein files. Wall-to-wall coverage of Venezuela. Will that be enough to completely shift attention permanently away from the Epstein files? A lot will depend on whether the media take the bait of continuing to focus on Venezuela, or if they come back to Epstein and what that means for the Trump administration and really for the integrity of legality in the United States.
We'll get back to Venezuela in just a few minutes, but Iran has been working its way into the headlines as well. Nationwide protests there, driven by economic issues, have, according to the authorities, been partially stirred up by the U.S. and Israel. Meenakshi Ravi has been on this story.
Videos of protests in Iran have flooded online feeds. Images from Tehran's central markets, where the demonstrations first took hold, and from cities across the country. Economic protests are not new in Iran, but the current geopolitical moment and the messaging surrounding it has added other elements into the mix, including the messaging coming out of Israel.
It's up to the Iranian people, and we understand what they're going through, and we're very sympathetic to them.
Since Israel's bombing of Iran last year, Prime Minister Netanyahu has lobbied the Trump White House relentlessly to keep the pressure on Tehran. Messaging from the president has become increasingly explicit. On social media, Donald Trump warned that if Iran kills peaceful protesters, the United States would come to their rescue. "We are locked and loaded and ready to go," he said. And senior figures from across the US government have also weighed in, and they're not mincing their words.
To the Ayatollahs, you need to understand, if you keep killing your people who are demanding a better life, Donald J. Trump is going to kill you.
Iran's exiled monarchist figurehead, Reza Pahlavi, son of the former Shah of Iran, has surfaced as well, as he tends to whenever protesters hit the streets, to stake his claim in this moment. The Washington Post helped him out, allowing him to write an op-ed for the paper. Pahlavi was also platformed by the Wall Street Journal and Fox News.
I've trained all my life to serve my nation. I'm more than ever ready to step in Iran, and I'll be there with my compatriots to lead the ultimate battle.
As the protests have spread, security forces have hardened their response. The Iranian government has not released any casualty figures, but rights groups say at least 36 people have been killed and more than 2,000 arrested. Iran's most senior judge has warned there will be no leniency for those he says are, quote, operating in line with the enemies of the Islamic Republic.
Thanks, Meena. Returning to Venezuela now, and a deeper dive into the coverage with the help of a journalist who knows Latin America. This has been such a topsy-turvy story, with conflicting narratives and justifications coming out of the White House day after day. And while the administration has been flooding the zone with news material that the media have picked up on, the reporting coming out of Venezuela about the people affected has come up short, both in terms of volume and the kind of content that we've been seeing. To help us make sense of it all, if such a thing is possible, we are joined by José Luis Granados Ceja of Dropsite News. He heads up their Latin America desk from Mexico City. You've covered Latin America. You know about America's habit of meddling in that part of the world, so you're familiar with the history, the kind of news coverage that comes out of the U.S. at times like this. Has anything jumped out at you over this past week, the media output, the kind of terminology that's been used to describe this story?
You know, it's been really surprising to see how certain media outlets have been reluctant to describe what actually happened. And I think we all saw what happened that early morning on Saturday. It was a kidnapping. It was the United States using its military might to invade a country, to massacre a lot of people, Venezuelans, Cubans, in order to kidnap a president because that president was too inconvenient for their foreign policy. And then the rush to try to make it about resources. And of course, we have to remember, Venezuela is a country that since the election of Hugo Chavez in 1998 has been undergoing a revolution that was basically centered on the need to use the country's oil wealth for the benefit of the population. I think this is a really important watershed moment for the region, arguably for the entire world, about the kind of world we do live in, about how there seems to be an insistence now that might makes right. This brazen act should have rung all of the alarm bells. You know, some of the early statements were really quite weak.
Even if an arrest violates some of the principles or tenets of international law, it doesn't mean that the case gets dismissed.
Obviously, there are question marks about legality and what comes next, but as a military operation, it was very effective.
I think really the lack of forceful condemnation is opening the door to a kind of future that I'm worried about, that I think makes everybody less safe.
When looking at the coverage of Venezuela itself, there's been a lot said about Maduro's rule, the mismanagement, the repression, economic situation. What has struck you as some of the most reductive or particularly outrageous lines in that narrative? And what in the context here has gone missing?
So, of course, we have to talk about the fact that, you know, the war by the U.S. against Venezuela didn't start this week. It started at the beginning of the century, quite literally, when in 2002 there was a U.S.-backed coup against Hugo Chavez that actually briefly ousted him from power. This has been a very long campaign. We have seen so many efforts at regime change in Venezuela, driven by international actors, principally the United States. I mean, it's just action after action after action that got us here. You know, a lot of people talk about the political realities or questioning the results of the 2024 election. And I always say, you know, you can't talk about free and fair elections when you have the world's most powerful country pointing its guns at you the way that the United States has. And all of that has been missing. There's always been the caricature of Maduro as kind of the brutal despot and the dictator and you know, rules by repression. And there's one thing that I would say here that I would really highlight is that there's never an effort to really get to the grassroots. You know, there are millions of revolutionaries, grassroots organizers in Venezuela who deeply believe in their project, who want to put their little bit of effort into the construction of a different style of economy. Yes, socialism is still on the agenda in Venezuela. The communards marching in Caracas, calling for the return of Nicolas Maduro and Cilia Flores, and doing so on that basis, saying we are communards, we run our territories, we decide what happens, we are constructing something new here in Venezuela. And there's never really any airtime for them when they are some of the most extraordinarily committed people in that country. And they are the ones that I would put at the forefront when we talk about Venezuela, because they're really the motors of everything that has been happening in that country in a positive sense.
You've made a strong argument for the support that Maduro has and had in Venezuela, but to be clear, there was repression under his rule, including of the press, journalists at times. Was what he did on that score defensible?
I think when we think about Venezuelan politics, we should think about it as being extraordinary on a daily basis, in the sense that there are sometimes extraordinary measures like these to try to control dissent in critical moments because of the history of the country, because there have been coup attempts, because there have been sabotage attempts. These have always been ridiculed as to say that, oh no, the US is never going to do that. You know, they couldn't possibly conceive of it, and yet it did happen. And so that, I think, helps us understand why you do see, essentially, yes, the heavy hand of the state to try to preserve the political unity of the country. Now, obviously, there have been cases of abuse, and that is where it's important to actually defend Venezuela's institutions, to say these institutions need to jump in and actually hold these bad actors accountable. Because there are, of course, like in any country, there are people who exceed their functions, or non-state actors who also break the law. There cannot be impunity. Nothing justifies impunity. A message has to be sent that when crimes are committed, they should be punished.
Prior to this past week, few people outside of Venezuela had ever heard the name Delcy Rodriguez. The assumption was that if Trump took power away from Maduro, he would end up handing it to Maria Corina Machado, the opposition figure. Instead, it's Rodriguez, Maduro's vice president. So what do we need to know about Delcy Rodriguez, her CV, and what is it about her that the Americans like?
You know, she's actually quite an interesting figure. Her father was an organizer, a communist, and was killed by the state. And that forced her to have to reckon with how to interact with a world that is willing to kill your family members because of their political convictions. And so she decided to actually go into law and became a labor lawyer, actually. She studied in Paris. She speaks English. She speaks French. She was always kind of you think of her as like a loyal organizer, soldier of the Bolivarian Revolution. Always someone who was, high profile because of her talents. There were some documents there, apparently, from the CIA where even they admit that they felt that they could work better with her, interestingly enough. And so, obviously, she's someone who finds herself in an extraordinary position. And I think the challenge before her now is to use her skills to maintain unity in the country. Really, this is the key question, I think, facing Venezuela right now. This is an unstable moment. As you well said, Maria Corina Machado, who looked like they were trying to position her, doesn't appear to be poised to take over, and I don't think is actually in a position to even try in this moment. Of course, she doesn't find herself in the country, but also, even if she did, Trump said as much, admitting that she doesn't have the actual capacity to lead the country.
Well, I think it would be very tough for her to be the leader. She doesn't have the support within or the respect within the country.
You know who does? In my estimation, it is Delcy Rodriguez, to try to keep the country together in this really critical time. And of course, rallying all of those different forces around her inside the country.
Do you buy the Nobel Peace Prize angle that Trump's resentment of the awarding of the Peace Prize to Machado instead of to him had anything to do with Washington's decision to go with Rodriguez? And have we ever seen a story like this, Jose Luis, where jealousy may have affected this kind of policy decision?
With Trump, you never know. He denies it, apparently. In a report, he said, no, that had nothing to do with it. But he is a man who's very much driven by ego, and I can't help but think that he did take a personal offense that someone other than him won the Peace Prize. But no, I don't think that actually was the primary motivation. They're interested in the resources. And that's why we've heard from them over and over and over again. So this is about U.S. dominance over Latin America. And so for them, it's actually more convenient to not have the instability of regime change, of putting someone like Maria Corina Machado into power, because she would preside over an incredibly unstable situation.
We're going to leave it there. Jose Luis Granados Ceja of Dropsite News, thank you so much for speaking with us here at the Listening Post today.
Thank you much for inviting me.
And finally, late last year, the U.S. Defense Secretary, or as he prefers to be known, the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, rolled out a new press policy. It required journalists seeking access to the Pentagon to agree to a set of reporting conditions. No wonder most major news outlets, including ABC, CBS, NBC, and even Fox News, refused to sign up, resulting in their correspondents being locked out of military briefings. A few weeks later, when the administration carried out a brazen act of war in Venezuela, abducting its president, the only so-called journalists with access to the briefing room was a group of right-wing, Trump-friendly influencers. And as of this recording, the new Pentagon press corps has had only one official briefing that did not deal with much apart from attacking the legacy media for choosing to quote-unquote self-deport. And as far as we can tell, it has not produced any real news about the Venezuelan operation, just a flurry of online content that the president would consider meme-tastic, if not actually informative.